Rituals are always rich and significant, filled with significance, practice for anthropologists to draw on when they're trying to understand what it means to be human. But there's one particular subset of rituals that is especially interesting to anthropologists, and these are rites of passage. Rites of passage are probably something that are familiar to you. There's rites of passage that are religious and rites of passage that are not religious, and I'll just define it broadly, and then you can, on your own, you can figure out when a rite of passage might be religious. In other words, when it relates to the sacred and the profane and is collectively shared by a moral community, and when rites of passage are not religious, they might be communal acts, but not necessarily with regards to the sacred and the profane. So rites of passage was first written about by a Belgian scholar, Arnold van Gennep, sometimes pronounced Arnold van Gennep. I'm not sure which one is the correct pronunciation. It has since been picked up by a very well-known anthropologist named Victor Turner, who's since passed, but his work remains very relevant and accurate. So I'll be mostly quoting from Vic Turner, who says that rites of passage are a specific subset of rituals, ones that transition individuals from one personhood to another personhood. Now remember that individuals refers to specific bodies, right, and one anatomical being, while person are the categories that society defines, and so rites of passage help individuals transition from one personhood to another personhood, or from one person to another person. Rites of passage, Turner says, are rites which accompany every change of place, state, social position, and age. They transition you from one state to another state, or from person one to person two, if you will. And rites of passage almost universally have three phases. And at their very kind of basic terminology, they sound a little silly, but it's actually important to tease out the three phases. So the first one is called the preliminal stage. The second one is called the liminal stage. And as you can probably guess, the third one is called the post-liminal stage. So preliminal, liminal, post-liminal. And if you're not sure what liminal means, I'll tell you it means in the middle. So one is called before the middle, one is called the middle, and one is called after the middle. Those terms by itself aren't that useful, but there's specific characteristics to each phase that make them interesting. So the first preliminal stage could be imagined as the separation. It's a symbolic death. So the old person that you were has died, but the new person has not yet been born. So if you imagine any rite of passage, a wedding, a bar mitzvah, a graduation ceremony, so religious ones and secular ones, the old person, the bachelor, the child, the ungraduated or uneducated individual, that person has died, but the new one has not yet been born, and so the first phase is usually rife with symbolism of death. The body is not dead, the individual is still there, but the person is dead. The second phase, and this is probably the one that's most relevant, usually takes up the biggest part of the ritual and is most important for the whole ritual itself. If you think about it, at this moment you have an individual whose person died, and so their connections to society are tenable, they're questionable, they're hard to kind of articulate because personhoods define the nature of the relationship between individuals, and so if you have an individual with no person, everything is sort of up for grabs. This is considered a very dangerous phase, not only for the society but for the individual themselves. They're not quite attached. The old attachments are no longer there. There aren't any new ones yet, and so there are a set of rules that refer specifically just to this liminal phase. The liminal phase is called margin or transition. A lot of times this phase is marked by something that we call comunitas, where the structures of everyday life fall away, and everyone who's participating in this rite of passage collectively become a unit. So the everyday structures, any differences that might be set between them as in their everyday lives, so age differences, gender differences, status differences, all those fall away, and everyone who goes through the ritual together gets into this kind of state of comunitas, where the differences of everyday life are no longer important and you are now a unit. You might even imagine them all as one body that's transitioning through this process together. The liminal phase usually is filled with symbolism of reversals. So you might take on roles that are inappropriate. The everyday distinctions disappear. There might be changed language, changed clothing. We call this, another way to think of this is anti-structure or seclusion. Bonds that are forged between people that in everyday life fall away, and new bonds come to be forged in this particular moment. So this is the liminal stage. It's in and out of society. The rules are changed, as I mentioned. There's a separate language, separate clothing, separate behavior, separate rules. The liminal phase is often filled with symbolism of lowliness and sacredness. So both of those things actually hand in hand, and it's considered a moment in and out of time. The third phase, post-liminal, is, you might describe it, sometimes it's described as aggregation or reincorporation. This is filled with symbols of rebirth, as you can imagine. If the old person died, there's that moment where the individual has no person. The third phase is when they're introduced with their new personhood. Usually the rites of passage transition people from a lower person to a higher person, meaning a lower status person to a higher status person. That's not always the case, but most of the time that's the case. You transition from a low status person to a high status person, and this is the moment to reintroduce the individual with their new personhood to society. So frequently it's rife with symbolism of rebirth. We've read one example of the hijras where they wear a bride's dress for their reintroduction ceremony. So this is the reaggregation or reincorporation of that individual into society with their new status, with their new person, and therefore their new set of rules and obligations towards other members of society as defined by their new person.